It seemed like just another common approach. He stopped, accused, tried to intimidate, but in that moment, with the wrong look at the wrong person, he sealed his own fate. That afternoon, in the street and in front of everyone, he found out, in the worst possible way, who the Black Marine was, and paid the price with no way to escape. Now take a deep breath, because what happened next will keep you hooked until the last second. He stopped her. For no reason, just out of pure arrogance. He accused her of being a liar. He tried to take control of the situation with a thoughtless gesture, with the certainty that he had the power in his hands. A fatal error. Those that leave deep scars and mark not only the body, but the soul. Because, as anyone who has ever known Imani Harper's true strength knew, she would never be dominated by someone who didn't know what they were doing. In Baton Rouge, the late afternoon sun bathed the streets in a golden hue, staining the cracked sidewalks with a soft, melancholic light, as if the day itself was about to say goodbye. Imani advanced through the streets with the precision and focus of a storm about to break loose, calm, controlled, but with an inner strength that could explode at any moment. With each step, the weight of years of training and discipline carried his unchanging posture. His dark, penetrating eyes roamed the neighborhood like sharp blades, analyzing everything, absorbing every detail with a coldness that only those who have faced hell knew how to maintain. The neighborhood, the one he knew so well, seemed suspended. In time, the two heavy memories still hung in the air. That place, it was like an old song, familiar but filled with pain. Every corner brought back memories of times she would rather not revisit. The corner store with an old soda promotion, the barber who still had his faded sign hanging over the door, the soccer field that, as always, was full of boys playing, with the intensity of those who feel their lives depend on that moment. The smell of old Miss Laverne's fried fish perfumed the air, and the distant laughter, the voices, everything dragged Imani to a past she wanted to keep buried, where the shadows of what she had lost still haunted her. 7 years, 7 long years, have passed since she left that place behind. 7 years of military service, 7 years since he buried his mother and promised he would never let himself become weak again. Now, upon returning, it seemed like everything had stopped. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The feeling was that time had stagnated. But Imani knew that time, for her, would never be the same. With her backpack on her shoulder, she walked slowly, but with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was. His clothes didn't say military. There was no badge or uniform, just a simple t-shirt, worn-out cargo pants, and weather-worn sneakers. But his stance, that didn't lie. Straight shoulders, a fixed gaze on the horizon, firm and determined. Steps, the posture of a warrior, as her father always used to say. He would have been proud of her if she was still there. But he wasn't, and it was for him, for his memory, that she remained standing. Across the street, a teenager watched her, his penetrating gaze trying to decipher who she was. When their eyes met, he said with curiosity mixed with reverence, "Are you in the military?" Imani gave a small, almost imperceptible smile and replied, with the calm of someone who has been through so many battles. Something like that. Before he could ask any more questions, he disappeared with his friends, and she moved on. These moments reminded her of everything she had experienced, everything she had left behind. Kandahar, Fallujah, Mogadishu. They weren't just places, they were memories of hell she had gone through, leading men into impossible situations where fear was a constant shadow and survival was a necessity. But now he was back in a place that felt familiar, but at the same time became increasingly distant. That's when the sound cut through the stillness of the moment. The sound of tires rolling slowly. A patrol car. She didn't need to look to know who was approaching. The car window rolled down with a slight click, and then the familiar but unwanted voice rang out. "Excuse me, miss." She turned enough to capture his face, and soon her eyes locked on Derek Simmons, the middle-aged officer who seemed to want more than just answers. With his crooked smile and that look of superiority, he said, "What are you doing here?" The voice, full of authority, could not hide the veiled intention of control, the need to assert his position. He wasn't just questioning, he was challenging. Imani, with the unwavering calm that defined her, replied without haste, "I'm just walking." The tension in the air grew like a storm about to break. Simmons, like a cornered lion, approached the car, crossed his arms and, with an even more authoritative tone, blurted out the classic line, "Just doing my job." But Imani knew it wasn't work, it was power, a fragile and unjustified power that he tried to exert over her. Control was on the line, and Simmons was about to miss. He took the next step, a bold move. He put the car in neutral and without hesitation said, "Let me see some identification." Imani didn't back down. Instead, he read his surroundings accurately. The familiar sidewalks, the curious looks of neighbors, and the feeling that the situation was becoming a public spectacle. She took out her military card slowly, without rushing to hand it over, just showing it calmly, without breaking her gaze. Simmons, with an impatient movement, grabbed the wallet tightly, turning the document over with disdain. "Navy SEALs. Is this a joke?" His voice was full of mockery. Imani, unshakable, just held his gaze, but Simmons didn't seem satisfied. He wanted more than a simple exchange of words. He wanted provocation. He wanted to dominate her, humiliate her there in front of everyone. And perhaps, if he had been more astute, he would have realized that the game was changing. A young woman had already started filming, the glow of her cell phone standing out like a silent witness. Others began to stop and watch. The tension increased. The power was shifting, and Simmons couldn't tell. "Give the document back," Imani asked, her voice firm, without wavering. But Simmons, with a sneer, made yet another false step. He walked straight into the error, challenging her. "Out here. I call the shots." When he tried to grab her wrist, what happened next was almost imperceptible. A subtle, dry movement. He lost his grip before he even got it. Surprised, he took a step back, his gaze now full of doubt, as if he finally realized that messing with Imani Harper was a mistake he couldn't correct. The reaction was so quick and so precise that he stood there, astonished, as silence took over the scene. "Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this moment? Do you agree with Imani's choices, or do you think she could have done something different? Leave your opinions in the comments. Let's talk about it. I want to know what you think. And if you like this type of content, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the next videos. Let's continue this discussion." The murmur of the crowd grew, like a wave getting ready to break. The voices intertwined in a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "She escaped him," someone exclaimed, the phrase spreading quickly, like a whisper becoming a scream. A young woman with her cell phone in hand filmed everything with a satisfied smile, her nimble fingers touching the screen as she captured every moment of that clash that was becoming a public spectacle. She knew she was witnessing something that would be etched in the memory of everyone there. The subtle laugh on the young woman's lips was one of victory, as if the simple act of witnessing that was a form of justice. Across the street, Simmons was completely out of control. His face was red, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as if he was trying to control an anger that was visibly boiling over. His eyes, full of fury, were fixed on Imani. He panted, each breath heavier than the last, but nothing seemed to have the ability to make him back away. The attempt at control that he so desired seemed to be dissipating in the face of Imani's tranquility, who, almost disconcertingly, remained calm as a serene lake, despite the chaos around her. Imani didn't move. She stood there, in the center of the rising tension, her posture impeccable and her eyes like sharp blades, watching Simmons with the same precision that a predator watches its prey. She felt the pressure of the moment, knew the danger had not passed, but instead of succumbing to the adrenaline of the confrontation, she remained relentless, as if she were on a mental battlefield where every word and every move counted. The surrounding crowd, now more than spectators, were turning into silent judges. Every look, every cell phone raised, contributed to the weight of the scene. Imani couldn't afford to make mistakes now. She knew that somehow that situation would transcend the simple clash between her and Simmons. She was the point of resistance, the symbol of silent strength in the face of authority that sought to impose itself without justification. It was then that the tension reached its peak. Her voice low but sharp as a razor's edge, Imani asked, her expression unchanged, "Are we breaking up, Simmons?" The question hung in the air, stretching, challenging the officer's arrogance. He was at a point of no return, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of power, but it was clear that control had shifted into Imani's hands. Her every word felt like a well-aimed blow, every syllable an accusation. The silence that followed was dense, filled with expectation. Simmons, with anger boiling inside him, searched for an answer, something to hold on to. But deep down, he knew he had lost control of the situation. He was no longer in command. Imani looked at him without moving a muscle, and her piercing eyes were enough to let Simmons know he was dealing with something much bigger than he had ever imagined. A woman who not only knew the power of calm, but also the strength to resist, to remain firm in the face of everything. She didn't need to do anything else. The simple fact of being there, of not backing down, said it all. The crowd waited, as if waiting for the final blow. And what was this blow, if not Imani's own unshakable presence? She didn't need to fight physically. She didn't need dramatic gestures. Her posture, her confidence, and her calm were the response that the public expected, and that Simmons, no matter how hard she tried, would never be able to get it from her. Simmons ultimately seemed to have become a spectator to his own failure. With every second that passed, the humiliation sank him deeper. What was left for him but to recognize that the battle was lost? Simmons did not respond. He couldn't. The audience, now completely engaged, eagerly awaited more. But it was then that a new voice cut through the air, deep and authoritative. "What's going on here?" It was Sergeant Burke. He entered the field of vision like an imposing presence, his steady and slow footsteps echoing in the silent street. Older and more experienced, he already knew something was very wrong. His gaze swept across the scene with X-ray precision, settling first on Simmons, who was still panting, his eyes wild with rage, and then moving on to Imani, who, in the middle of the street, looked like an unshakable rock, calm personified. The crowd, which had previously been dispersed in murmurs and curiosity, now lined up around her like an attentive audience, awaiting the outcome of a drama that had gone on for too long. Burke paused before approaching, his intense gaze fixing on Simmons with silent fury, as if he was waiting for the officer to finally realize the gravity of the situation. He knew, and Simmons knew too, that the question now was no longer about who had the power, but who was telling the truth. And it was clear that Simmons was in an increasingly vulnerable position. "Explanations, Simmons," Burke said in a deep voice, calmer than expected, but carrying a weight that only experience could provide. Simmons, still beside himself, tried to justify himself, but his words came out weakly, like a desperate sigh that barely cut the air. She resisted. She became aggressive, trying to cling to a thread of control that was already falling apart, but her tone didn't convince anyone. Immediately, the young woman with the cell phone, who had already become a central figure in the scene, didn't let the lie go. "Bullshit, we all saw it," she said, her voice clear and audible to everyone around. The truth was there, out in the open, no longer hidden in Simmons' broken words. The crowd felt the weight of it, their murmurs quieter now, as if the air had grown thicker, imbued with the impact of the revelation. Burke turned his head to Imani, who, silent, was still observing the scene with impeccable composure. Her eyes were serene, but it was clear that she was no longer on that street, just as a witness. She was the judge, the challenger, and the response to the situation. He knew that her version made sense, that her posture and behavior said it all. Imani, in her stillness, had become the symbol of truth in that dispute of words and power. The sergeant then looked down at the ID that Simmons was still holding with trembling fingers. It was almost symbolic. The piece of plastic that was supposed to represent authority and power now became the mark of his imminent defeat. Burke stared at him for a moment, as if that were the last piece of the puzzle that would complete the picture of the humiliation Simmons was about to face. Imani, who until then hadn't said a word beyond what was necessary, knew she didn't need any more explanations. She didn't need to prove anything. His presence, his posture, and the history he carried spoke for themselves. Just being who she was, with her rank, her training, and her experience, was a definitive answer to anyone who doubted her. At that moment, Imani was the authority. Simmons' face paled visibly. The color drained from his skin, leaving it grey, as if all the strength and arrogance he had disappeared in the face of the inevitability of the moment. The murmur in the crowd grew, eyes fixed on him with a curiosity that bordered on pleasure. The weight of shame seemed to suffocate him, and he didn't know where else to look. It was then that Burke, with the look of a veteran who has seen many battles, asked the question that would seal everything. His voice, low but with the authority that only a man with decades of experience could have, cut through the silence. "Are you a Navy SEAL?" The air seemed to freeze for a second. The impact of the question reverberated through every person there. The silence was absolute. Simmons, no longer able to deny it, just looked at the ID, which made his body shrink, as if shame had the power to make him smaller. He didn't dare answer. There were no more words he could use. The lie crumbled in the face of relentless reality. Sergeant Burke didn't have to wait any longer. The answer was there, clear, written all over Simmons' face. He knew the battle was already decided, and Simmons himself now saw himself as the villain of the story. "Did you know that?" Burke asked, and Simmons, now speechless, just shook his head, as if he no longer had the strength to lie. Burke didn't wait for more answers. "Does anyone have a recording of this?" he asked, and at least 10 hands shot up in unison. The young woman with the cell phone, satisfied, replied with a smile, "I have everything." The atmosphere was tense, but Imani remained motionless, waiting. Simmons knew his public humiliation was irreversible. He had made the biggest mistake of his life, and everyone was watching. Then Burke's voice cut through the tension, low but definitive. "Officer Simmons, you are removed from duty, effective immediately." The murmur of the crowd grew in disbelief, but no one dared to protest. Simmons writhed in rage, his fists clenched in fury. "You can't be serious. I suggest you stop talking before you make things worse," Burke warned, his tone clear and definitive. Simmons looked like a cornered animal. His nostrils flared, but he knew he had no more room to fight back. The battle was lost. Imani kept her gaze fixed on him, as if she knew exactly what was happening. She had won, and Simmons knew it. The defeat was his, public and irremediable. Burke turned to her, his stance now respectful, not defensive. "Lieutenant Harper, do you wish to press charges?" he asked. The crowd waited anxiously for the answer. Imani, with a slow sigh, let the question hang in the air before answering simply, "No." Surprise ran through the crowd, and even Burke seemed to absorb the weight of the response. "He is sure?" he insisted. Imani, with unshakable serenity, nodded. "I didn't come home looking for a fight. I just wanted to walk in my own neighborhood." His words fell heavy, and the atmosphere around him calmed, but their impact would remain. It was Sergeant Burke. He appeared at the corner of the street with such an imposing presence that it seemed as if time slowed down as he approached. His footsteps were steady and calculated, echoing on the silent sidewalk, a heavy sound that contrasted with the tension in the air. His eyes, marked by the experience of years of service, had already read the scene in a single instant. He knew something was very wrong. His gaze cut through the crowd, first settling on Simmons, who was still panting, his face red with anger, his veins pulsing with frustration. The sergeant's gaze quickly swept over the man, analyzing his rigid posture and the clear signs of someone who had lost control. Then Burke's eyes turned to Imani, who, in the midst of the chaos, remained implacable, her eyes so calm that they seemed like a calm force in the midst of the storm. She was like a rock, unshakable, and this made the crowds previously dispersed. Gazes focus on her as if they were waiting for the outcome of a story that had already lasted too long. Burke paused for a moment, observing the scene with the eyes of someone who had seen this dynamic before, but now knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. He didn't need any further explanations to understand that the situation had gotten out of Simmons' control. His expression was cold, and his gaze fixed intensely on the officer, almost like an animal hunting its prey. He wanted Simmons to know, without words, that time to escape was running out. "Explanation, Simmons," Burke ordered in a deep voice, calm but carrying a weight that only experience could provide. His tone was that of a commander who knows exactly when and how to intervene. Simmons, feeling pressured, opened his mouth to justify himself, but his words came out weak, lacking confidence. She resisted, she became aggressive. He tried to cling to his last line of defense, but his eyes were desperate, searching for something or someone to rescue him from the situation he had created. However, his voice did not have the authority he imagined. The words seemed to waver in the air, unsteady, as if the very weight of the lie was draining their energy. At that exact moment, the young woman with the cell phone, who had already become a central figure in the scene, cut off the justification with a sharp tone. "Bullshit, we all saw it," she said, her voice clear and crisp, echoing down the street and reaching every ear present. The impact of his words was instantaneous. The truth was no longer being told by Imani's actions alone. Now it was written unmistakably in the eyes of the crowd. Simmons's lie had been exposed beyond question. The murmur in the streets grew quieter, as if the air had thickened, charged with the weight of revelation. The truth, finally, was within everyone's reach. Burke turned his head to Imani, who continued to observe the scene with impressive tranquility. His eyes, serene as a lake on a windless day, revealed a silent strength. Imani didn't need to do anything else. She didn't need to shout or make speeches. She was there to represent truth and justice, and the way she remained still, without even moving, spoke more than any words could. She was living proof that right didn't need validation from anyone. His behavior, his posture, his firm gaze conveyed what Simmons had never understood. Authority was not in those who shouted loudest or controlled brute force, but rather in those who knew what was right and remained firm. Sergeant Burke, who was already observing the situation with the eyes of a veteran, then directed his gaze to the ID that Simmons was holding with trembling hands. The plastic, which was supposed to symbolize power and authority, now felt like a weight, a symbol of impending defeat. Burke looked at him for a moment, his mind sharp as a razor, before he finally understood what was going on in Simmons's mind. That piece of plastic, once his banner of strength, now represented his downfall. It was like the last piece of the puzzle that revealed the true nature of the situation. Imani, who until that moment had remained silent, knew she didn't need any more words. She had nothing left to prove. Her presence, the silent strength that emanated from her, and the way she held her posture spoke for themselves. The fact that he was who he was, with his training, his experience, and his moral code, said more than any argument or speech could. She wasn't there to win or convince anyone. She was there because the truth was stronger than any lie. Simmons, watching the scene unfold, felt the color drain from his face. His skin, once tanned with arrogance, now looked pale, almost grey, as if his energy had been drained by the shame that was building inside him. The murmur of the crowd increased, but it was no longer a scattered and curious crowd. It was an audience that awaited, with silent hunger, the outcome of a drama that was finally about to reveal itself. The looks were fixed, anxious, some almost avid, as if each one already knew that Simmons was about to become the villain of the story. It was then that Burke, with the calm and considered look of someone who has faced countless battles, asked the question that would seal everything. His voice, low and controlled but full of authority, cut through the silence with surgical precision. "Are you a Navy SEAL?" The impact of the question was immediate. The air, which had previously been dense, seemed to freeze for a second. All eyes were fixed on Simmons, and the silence that followed was absolute, as if time itself had stopped. Simmons, no longer able to deny it, looked at the ID he still held with trembling hands, his expression closing in, shrinking under the weight of shame. He didn't dare answer. There were no more words that could come out of his mouth. The lie, which he had maintained until that moment, crumbled in the face of relentless reality. Burke didn't have to wait any longer. The answer was written all over Simmons's face, and he knew there was no more room for justification or defense. The battle was already decided. Simmons, who thought he had control, was now a defeated man, exposed in front of everyone. The truth once again had prevailed. Simmons pleaded no contest. His fists were clenched, his body rigid as he walked to the patrol car. Cameras captured every moment of his fall. When the car door closed with a bang, Burke exhaled and turned to the crowd. "Show's over, guys." Some people began to disperse, but others remained. The young woman with the cell phone gave Burke a stern look before lowering the camera. "He'll be back on duty in a few weeks, won't he?" she asked impassively. Burke didn't respond. "Just send the video," he said, turning to his car. Imani, with the weight of victory and frustration, continued her journey. But each step took her away from something greater, something she didn't know if she could ever truly overcome. Burke ran a hand over his temples, his fingers pressing into tired skin as he tried to process what had just happened. He knew the signs were there, visible to everyone. The words, the looks, the tense energy that permeated the room. All of this indicated the inevitable. He had already ignored what was happening inside him, the uncomfortable feeling that compelled him to act differently. But now everything was registered. And it wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a failure in front of everyone. The city was watching, and the truth had been captured on video. The weight of responsibility was there, like a shadow, following every step he took. Imani sat on the back steps of her father's house, the sound of the old floorboards creaking beneath her. With every movement, the heat of the day seemed to have spread through the air, making everything denser. The smell of cut grass mixed with the soft sound of something frying in a nearby neighbor's kitchen. For the first time in hours, she allowed her shoulders to relax, feeling the tension of the day melt away, if only for a brief moment. She was home, but the question echoing in her mind was, what did this mean now? What did home really feel like when the experience you've lived through and the city you call home didn't seem to be on your side? The screen door creaked, breaking. The silence that had settled in. You always sit like this when you're thinking. The soft voice, but full of familiarity, was Uncle Ray's. He appeared at her side, with his broad shoulders and grey hair at the temples, the typical figure of someone who lived more than he could count. He placed a bottle of iced tea next to him and opened his own, the sound of the metal releasing, with a sigh. The silence between the two stretched for a moment, a silence that didn't need words. Ray, taking a deep breath, exhaled through his lips. "So, you were in the news." He looked at her, in no rush to make a more scathing comment. Imani let out a dry, humorless little laugh. "I wasn't planning to." Ray shook his head, as if he already knew the story. "We never are, but trouble finds us anyway. There's no escaping it." Imani turned the bottle of iced tea between her fingers, without looking at him. The cool liquid seemed to contrast with the growing tension that still accompanied her. "It wasn't a problem," she murmured, as if still trying to convince herself that it was just a misunderstanding. He raised an eyebrow and looked at her with a mix of understanding and exasperation. "It wasn't peace either," he said, his voice soft but punctuated by a harshness that only someone with his experience could convey. Imani did not respond immediately. She knew he was right. She had been trained for battles of a different nature, physical battles with weapons, brute force. But what about battles that weren't as visible, like today's? The ones that happened within a network of power, perception, and yes, prejudice. Those battles that couldn't be won with just the strength of your fists. She tipped the bottle back, letting the iced tea soothe her parched throat. Ray watched her, his eyes attentive and experienced. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees with a lightness that only years of practice and observation could provide. "You did well, girl." Imani nodded slowly, her head lowered, but her eyes focused ahead, as if trying to understand more deeply the meaning of that battle. "I did what I had to do," she said, the words coming out unhurriedly, as if those actions were already becoming part of her routine, one more thing she would need to carry. Ray gave a small laugh, his voice low and welcoming. "Just like your father." Imani smiled at that. The memory of her father was always with her, like a shadow that guided her. He had taught him that strength wasn't just about fighting, but about knowing when not to fight. Sometimes the greatest act of strength was resisting, the temptation to use your fists when the situation demanded more than that. "Simmons is going to feel this for a long time," Ray said thoughtfully, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he saw the future with a clarity that Imani couldn't yet achieve. But more than that, a lot of people saw what happened today, and they will remember. Imani turned the bottle in her hands, reflecting on his words. "Does this ever change anything?" she asked softly, almost wondering out loud if all this effort was worth it. Ray sighed deeply, running a hand through his beard with an expression that conveyed a mixture of tiredness and wisdom. "You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether it changes everything. The question is whether it changes something." Imani was silent for a moment, letting Ray's words sink into her mind. He was right. She hadn't changed the world. Today, not in a big way, but maybe, just maybe, she had changed something. Who knows, maybe a child in the crowd looked at what happened and realized they didn't need to cower in the face of authority. Maybe some police officer saw that and reconsidered their own actions in the future. Maybe even Simmons, though she doubted it, would look at himself and reflect. And for now, that was enough. Ray poked her with his elbow, a joke without malice, but which brought back the familiarity between them. "And now?" Imani sighed, setting the bottle of iced tea aside with a simple gesture. "I keep walking," he replied firmly, the answer clear in his mind despite the complexity of the situation. Ray smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "That's my girl." Sometimes the real fight wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing tall, even when the world tells you to walk away. It was about showing up, speaking your truth, and refusing to cower. Because even if you don't change everything, you can change something, and sometimes that's enough to initiate change. The sound of the wind rustling the trees, the distant hum of the city, everything seemed to disappear for a moment as Imani walked towards the future with the same silent strength that had always guided her. If you liked this story and want to see more moments like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, with each new video, you will find more incredible content that will make you think, get emotional, and of course inspire you to act. So click the subscribe button, activate the bell so you don't miss anything, and come be part of this journey with us. Let's do this together.